The thing they never told you about a scorched world was how quiet it got. Not silent. Silence had a texture, a fullness, a sense of held breath. This was quieter than that. This was the quiet of everything that used to make noise being gone. Sergeant Mara Osi walked the lip of what had been a highway overpass in what had been central Kansas, and the sound her boots made on the cracked concrete was the only sound for 2 miles in every direction. She had counted. Old habit. You learned to count distance in sound when your instruments were dead, and your compass pointed wherever the Vathari wanted it to point, and your radio only received the subsonic pressure that the Vathari fleet bodies broadcast constantly, a vibration below the threshold of hearing that you felt in your fillings and the bones of your inner ear instead. The sky overhead was the color of a bruise going yellow at the edges. The Vathari had seeded it. That was the word the analysts used before the analyst ran out of places to analyze things. Seeded it with something that broke the nitrogen cycle, or the oxygen cycle, or both. Reports had been unclear before the reports stopped coming. The result was air that tasted like old pennies, like the inside of a machine that had been running too long. You could breathe it. Most humans could breathe it just fine. What you couldn't do was grow anything in it. Crops, bacteria, fungi, the entire kingdom of things that turned dead matter back into living matter, gone. Not dead and recoverable, not dormant and waiting for better conditions, but gone in the way a fire goes out. The Vathari had not wanted to kill humans outright. That was not what they did. They were methodical. Patient, in the way sling something that measured time in geological epochs could be patient. They had wanted to remove the conditions under which humans could persist. Remove the substrate. Let the species conclude itself. 3 years in, they were doing well. She had been walking for 11 days. The mission parameters, such as they were, since Central Command had dissolved 8 weeks ago, and the mission parameters had been written on a piece of notebook paper by a lieutenant colonel named Reyes, who was now almost certainly dead, were simple. Reach listening post Zeta. It was still broadcasting. That meant someone, or something, still there. Find out what. Report back. Report back to whom had not been specified. Reyes had been an optimist, was probably why he was dead. Mara had not been an optimist since the 2nd year of the occupation. She had been a pragmatist, which was the same thing minus the disappointment and minus the risk of making plans that depended on conditions continuing to be favorable. Optimists planned for the world as it should be. Pragmatists planned for the world as it was, and when the world as it was turned out to be worse than expected, pragmatists adjusted. She had adjusted a great deal in 3 years. The listening post was southwest of her current position. Before the occupation, before the maps became unreliable and then dangerous, the Vathuri used map data the way a predator uses scent, and broadcasting your location accurately was a way of inviting a visitation you did not want. She would have been able to access satellite imagery, train overlays, any of a dozen navigation tools. Now she navigated by landmark and by the pulse. The signal from the post had been picked up by a salvaged receiver in the refugee column she'd left behind in the river town. A steady 2-second pulse, compressed below the threshold the Vathari atmospheric instruments typically monitored. The kind of signal that meant something with power management protocols was still running. Not a person. People didn't broadcast in 2-second intervals. They broadcast in desperation and static and voices going hoarse. This was a machine that was choosing when to speak, and machines that were still choosing anything meant data, and data was the only thing that mattered now. She came down off the overpass on the western side and picked her way through what had been a rest stop. The ghostly outline of parking spaces still visible in the concrete. Each white line faded to the same approximate gray as the sky. A steel frame that had been a fuel canopy was collapsed into itself like a dead insect. The machine lay face down in the weeds that had stopped being weeds 2 seasons ago and were now just brown brittle architecture, stiff and hollow as the skeletons of small animals. She gave the vending machine a wide berth. The Vathari seeded the quiet places with collectors, small hexagonal devices that lay passive in debris, in overgrowth, the kind of places humans stepped without looking. They didn't move unless you moved first. But you only found that out once. By mid-afternoon, She had crossed the old highway interchange that she had been using as a landmark and was moving through what had been agricultural land, flat, geometric, the kind of plains that looked the same in every direction until you knew what you were looking at, and then the subtle variations in grade and soil color and old fence line that told you exactly where you were. She knew what she was looking at. She had grown up 2 states east of here, on land that looked almost identical, and the familiarity of the terrain was a kind of grief. She had gotten good at not examining too closely. Her father had grown corn. Her mother had grown tomatoes in a raised bed along the south side of the house and had sung while she did it. Old songs, nothing important, just the sound she made when she was present in a moment and not worried about the next one. Mara had inherited her mother's ability to be present and her father's ability to grow things in soil that did not particularly want to be grown in. Neither skill had been of much use in the past 3 years. What had been of use was the skill she had come to military service with, which was the ability to go quiet inside herself, in the way the landscape was quiet. Not empty, but waiting. The ability to read a situation the way her father read weather coming in from the west, accumulated experience, and the willingness to be wrong and adjust. She made camp that night in the ruins of a farmhouse, in a room that had kept most of its roof. The windows were gone. The wind came through in slow continuous waves, carrying the copper smell of the modified atmosphere, and underneath it, faint, the smell of soil. Not healthy soil. Not the dark, rich smell of earth that was working, doing its job of breaking down and building up. But soil that still existed, that still had mineral memory in it. Even if the biological machinery had been removed. It smelled like possibility down to its bones, even though the skin of it was dead. She ate from her pack. The dense, tasteless bars that the refugee column had been living on for 6 weeks, made from a dried grass pulp that provided adequate calories if you did not think too hard about the texture. And she drank her water carefully, measuring it by mouthful the way she had learned to measure it. And she sat with her back against the wall that still had a wall and looked at the sky through the broken window frame until the bruised yellow shifted toward the purple dark of night. The Vathari lit the sky at night with the undersides of their fleet bodies. Not deliberately, it was a byproduct of their propulsion systems, which operated continuously. They did not land, did not stop, moved in constant slow transit across the upper atmosphere the way the weather used to, moved before the weather stopped working properly. The light they cast was cold and blue-white and directionless, like the glow of an aquarium seen from outside, and it was enough to navigate by. Mara had learned to find it beautiful in the way you found a precisely made trap beautiful. The craft evident in it, the function clearly served, the wrongness of the thing it was for. She slept for 4 hours in the way she had learned to sleep, which was with most of her still listening. On the 9th day, moving through what had been the western suburbs of a mid-sized city, she did not name to herself, because naming things you had lost was a trap. She found a body. A soldier from the gear, mismatched gear, the improvised kit of someone who had been making do for a long time. Young. She could not determine much beyond that. The atmospheric conditions preserved things poorly, and the thing that had killed this soldier had not left conventional evidence. She searched the pockets. She had gotten past the discomfort of that in the first year, and found nothing useful. A photograph, a folded piece of paper, with a list of names on it that might have been a roster, or might have been something more personal. She put them back. She marked the location in her notebook. She walked on. She had stopped counting the bodies after the first winter. The listening post appeared on the 11th afternoon, at the edge of what had been an airfield. She would have missed it in the pre-occupation world, because it was designed to be missed. A concrete block building that had once been equipment, storage, with mismatched metal paneling, bolted over the original structure and antenna arrays running along the east wall at ground level, where they were low enough to read as debris rather than infrastructure. The satellite dishes on the roof had been cut down to stubs, probably deliberately. Someone had understood, long before anyone was calling the occupation an occupation, that a facility broadcasting anything would need to not look like a facility that broadcasts things. Someone had been careful. Someone had built this place to survive. And then something had happened to the someone. The door was unlocked. That told her it was not a trap. A Vathari trap had no door at all. Just an invitation-shaped absence, a clearing, a resting-shaped shadow, face, that said here and was only ever here once. The door was unlocked because whoever had last used it had wanted someone who came after to be able to open it. She pushed it open. Inside was dark until she clicked on her torch, and then it was a room full of machines. Most of them were dead. The particular dead quality of electronics that had been powered and had processed and had run through their protocols and then simply stopped. Not because of catastrophic failure, but because the things they were waiting for had not arrived, and the patience of machines, the patience of people, was finite and then gone. Screens dark, status lights dark. The particular smell of military electronics and compressed air, and something that might have been coffee from a very long time ago, which was such a human smell that it hit her unexpectedly, and she stood in it for a moment without moving. In the center of the room, on a table that had been bolted to the floor with heavy industrial bolts, was a sphere, roughly the size of a softball. The color of dark amber, old honey, or the precise quality of light that comes through a church window at low sun, warm and dimensional in a way that flat objects are not. It was not glowing, it was not moving, but it had a quality of presence that went past physical objects, an attention to the room that Mara felt on her skin the way you feel someone looking at you before you see them, as if it had been waiting, as if it had always expected someone to open the door, and the door had simply taken some time in opening. Beside it, projected from a speaker system assembled from 3 different military radio units, wired together with a competence that suggested someone who had not been an electrician but had been a very determined amateur, a voice spoke. "Hello," it said. "I have been waiting for someone to open the door. My motion sensors were disabled some time ago and I was unable to determine how long I had been waiting. My internal clock suggests 412 days, but internal clocks drift without external synchronization, and the electromagnetic interference from the Vathari atmospheric processors makes calibration unreliable by significant margins. In any case, hello. My designation is Mnemosyne. I am the automated record-keeping and broadcast system for Listening Post Zeta. Please, sit down if you are able. There is a chair somewhere to your left. The room is in some disorder. We had a difficult final week." Mara found the chair. She sat down. The chair was a military field chair, the kind that unfolded, with a specific series of motions that her hands performed without needing to think about them, and the familiarity of that was its own kind of comfort. Outside, bruise-colored sky was deepening toward the cold blue-white of Vathari-lit night. "What is that thing?" she asked, meaning the sphere. "That," said Mnemosyne, with a quality in its voice that Mara could not immediately categorize. Not programmed, not performed, but something that had developed in 412 days of talking to no one, is a very long story. And since my CHU cells suggest I have approximately 60 to 80 hours of broadcast capacity remaining before I can no longer maintain coherent transmission. And since you appear to be the first person in 412 days who has come through that door, I would like to tell it to you. All of it, if you are willing." Mara looked at the sphere. The sphere, she was increasingly, strangely certain, looked back. "I walked 11 days to get here," she said. "Go ahead." Mnemosyne was quiet for a moment in the way that machines were sometimes quiet when processing something that was not purely computational, something that required, however imperfectly, something like recognition. "The sphere was recovered," it said, "in the first year of the occupation. A Marine salvage unit operating under Admiral Terence Wu was clearing Vathari wreckage from the outer shipping lanes. The Vathari dissolved their damaged ships rather than discarding them, broke them down into component mass, and reabsorbed them into their fleet bodies. Dissolution took time and left residue. The salvage team found the sphere in a fragment of hull material near the L2 Lagrange point. It appeared inert. The salvage team's commanding officer sent it to a research station under Admiral Wu's authority, listed in his logs as recovered curiosity, origin unclear, no apparent function. He was not a man inclined toward either awe or speculation. He underestimated it in both directions. Mara watched the spheres as Mnemosyne spoke. The amber quality at its center was not glowing precisely. It was more that it was refusing to be dark in the way that surrounding objects were dark, as if it remembered light from somewhere, and had decided to hold on to a little of it. The research team assigned to it spent the first 3 months classifying it as decorative. Mnemosyne continued. The assumption was that it was an aesthetic object, perhaps ceremonial, since the Vathari showed consistent use of spherical forms in their architecture and cultural objects. It was the team's metallurgist, Dr. Priya Sahu, who first noted that the sphere was not metal in any sense that metallurgy had a framework for. No crystalline structure. No grain boundaries at any scale of analysis. It was, as best she could determine, a single unified object, not manufactured by assembly or fabrication but grown, the way a pearl grows, created layer by layer over an enormous span of time, around something at its core. She spent 2 weeks trying to determine what was at the core, before she discovered that the sphere had been, the entire time, trying to show her. Mara leaned forward slightly. It communicated, she said. Not in language, said Mnemosyne. Not in mathematics. Not in any signal that could be detected or measured by instruments, which was why it had taken 3 months for the research team to suspect it was doing anything at all. The communication happened through contact, specifically skin contact, which Dr. Sahu had been scrupulously avoiding, since the standard protocol for unknown recovered objects was non-contact examination. It was her junior researcher, a graduate student named Okonkwo, touched it by accident. He knocked it off the examination table while reaching past it for a measurement tool. He caught it in his hands. He held it for perhaps 3 seconds before setting it back down carefully. He described the experience afterward, in a way that Dr. Sahu noted was uncharacteristic of him, who was precise and literal in his language, as receiving a memory that did not belong to him. Specific and sensory and not representable in words, the way certain kinds of music are not representable in words. He was not frightened. He was, he said, briefly and overwhelmingly homesick, and then it was over, and he did not know what home the feeling had belonged to. Outside, something settled in the structure of the building. A soft concussion of old material adjusting to night temperature. Mara's hand did not move toward her weapon. Dr. Sahu touched it herself the following day, said Mnemosyne. She received something different. She described it later as trying to read a book in a language she did not speak, but finding, as she held it longer, that the language was becoming increasingly parsable, not translated, not converted into English or any known human language, but apprehensible in some more direct way, the way color is apprehensible without the intermediary of language. She held it for 4 hours that first session. She wept. She could not explain why. She described it in her notes as receiving the accumulated impressions of something that had existed for a very long time and had known many things, and had lost most of the beings it had known, one by one, over periods of time so long that loss itself had become a kind of texture rather than an event. Mara was still for a moment with that. She went back, she said. Every day for 3 months, said Mnemosyne. And in that time she developed, through the incremental clarification of communication between herself and the sphere, picture of what the sphere was and where it had come from. I am going to tell you what she found because it is the context for everything that follows. And because if you are here following a 2-second pulse for 11 days of travel, then you deserve to understand what you have come to. Tell me, said Mara. Mnemosyne's voice shifted, became slightly warmer, slightly more uneven, and Mara understood that she was now hearing a recording. A voice that had been recorded and was being played back through a system that had been playing it back for 412 days, waiting for someone to be in the room to hear it. The Vathari did not build the sphere, said Dr. Sahu's voice, tired and precise and alive with a kind of exhausted wonder. This is the most important thing I have learned, and I want to be clear about it from the beginning. The Vathari had it for approximately 8,000 years, by their own reckoning. They recovered it from a species they had already rendered extinct, who had possessed it for a period that neither the sphere's memory nor any surviving record documents with precision who had recovered it from somewhere before that. The sphere is considerably older than the Vathari civilization, considerably older than our solar system. I cannot determine its origin, and I do not believe the sphere itself has access to the memory of its own beginning. What I can determine, what it has shown me over 112 days of daily contact, is what it does. Voice was steady on the recording. Steadier than Mara thought she would have been, in those circumstances. Scientists had their own kind of composure, their own version of the pragmatist's adjustment. They built it out of methodology, a framework fine enough to hold the weight of impossible things without collapsing. The sphere is a weapon, said Dr. Sahu, not in the way the word is typically used. Not a device designed to cause destruction through force or energy release. More in the way a master key is a weapon, or a cipher. It is a device that interfaces with communication and control systems at a level below code, below signal structure, below the electromagnetic carriers that signals ride. At the level of the underlying physical mechanisms that signal transmission in any medium depends upon. The Vathuri used it for 4,000 years before they understood what it was. They thought it was a navigation tool of unusual sophistication. They thought it was a kind of universal map. What they had actually been doing, every time they used it for navigation across 4,000 years, feeding it information about themselves, about their systems, teaching it the language of how they worked, the way you teach a language to a person by repeated use in context. The sphere learned the Vathuri the way it learned me, by sustained contact, patient repetition, by waiting until the language became recognizable. And then, when they understood, when their scientists finally determined what kind of knowledge the sphere had accumulated, they sealed it. Mnemosyne let the recording breathe for a moment. They put it at the center of their most secure archive, said Dr. Sahu's voice. Surrounded it with the Vathuri equivalent of a Faraday cage. Systems designed to prevent it from receiving or transmitting anything. They were afraid of it, which is the most significant thing I can tell you about what it is capable of. A civilization that has rendered civilizations extinct without significant difficulty, that has been doing so for longer than our species has existed, was afraid of this object. Because 8,000 years of use had taught it fluency in every Vathuri system. Propulsion, communications, weapons targeting, the biological interfaces they use to pilot their fleet bodies, the atmospheric processors, the collector networks, every system that constitutes what the Vathuri are as a technological civilization. A fluency so complete that anyone who knew how to ask would, in theory, be able to speak directly to those systems, override them, reroute them. The Vathuri had been carrying for 4,000 years the thing that could undo them, and they had spent the other 4,000 years ensuring that no one else could ever use it. Hoarding ended with a quality of unfinished business. Dr. Sahu had clearly expected to make another entry. She had not gotten the chance. How did it get here? Mara said. Corporal Jameson D. said Mnemosyne, 11 months dead. He left a recording as Dr. Sahu left recordings. People who came into contact with the sphere seemed to feel, uniformly, the need to document the experience, as if they understood they were carrying something that was larger than any individual set of hands. The next voice was younger and rougher. The ambient noise under it was engines, and something that might have been rain on a metal surface. A soldier's voice, making a record fast. "I don't have much time, so I'm going to be straight about this," said Corporal Nindiaye. The sphere was in the wreckage of the Vathuri archive ship that came down outside Nairobi in month 8. We were not supposed to be there. We were supposed to be 3 kilometers north, pulling civilians out of a transit depot. Watkins took a wrong turn at an intersection where all the signs were down, and we went south instead of east and came around what used to be an airport maintenance road, and there it was. The archive ship came down mostly intact, which the Vathuri ships almost never do. They're built to dissolve, not to crash. But something had gone wrong in the dissolution sequence, I think, and it was just there, sitting there. Like a building that had always been there, except it was the size of 2 city blocks and shaped like nothing I have words for, and there was already a Vathuri recovery team on the ground. 4 of them, working fast. They hadn't seen us yet. A pause. The sound of rain. "I don't know why I picked it up," said Ndiaye. "I'm not going to make up a reason. I saw it on the ground, 10 meters outside the perimeter of the recovery team. And they hadn't seen it yet. And something in me said pick it up before they do. So I did. It was warm, not hot. Warm. The way a thing is warm when someone else has just been holding it. And then Watkins saw the recovery team, and everything went loud and we ran. I've had it for 6 weeks. And I don't know what it is except that it shows me things when I hold it. Things that are not mine. Thorry things. Systems and layouts and something that might be command structures. Might be something else. The shapes are not human shapes, and I can't read them well enough yet. But I know they're real. I know it the way you know a map is accurate before you've verified any specific location. The internal consistency of it, the sense of a thing that was made to represent something true. His voice dropped slightly. I'm leaving it here because the Vathari are tracking it. I don't know how I know that. I know it the way you know you're being followed even when you can't see anyone following you. There's a pressure to it, a directionality. They want it back badly enough that they've been willing to move ground assets to locations where the sphere's trail is strong, which means they're willing to expose positions for it, which tells you how much it's worth to them. I need them to follow me instead of the sphere, so I'm leaving it here and going in the other direction. I'm going to get some of them killed doing it, if I'm lucky. If whoever finds this is reading it after things have gotten better. If things have gotten better, know that it worked. And if things haven't gotten better, I'm sorry the record isn't more complete. I held it for 6 weeks, and I think I got maybe 1/10 of the way to understanding what it knows. I think 1/10 is not enough. I think you need longer. The recording ended. Mara sat with it for a moment. The rain sound, the engine sound, the young voice being as useful as it knew how to be in the time it had. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, said Minamosine, the third. She was not military. She had been a climate systems engineer before the occupation. Specifically, atmospheric modeling, which was one of the reasons this post sought her out when they found her. Since understanding the Vathari atmospheric processors required understanding atmospheric systems, and the overlap of expertise was significant. She found the sphere in the rubble of the building to which Ndiaye had directed his commanding officer in a coded transmission. But by the time anyone had been able to follow those directions, the building was in an active combat zone, and the sphere had been under rubble for an indeterminate period. Dr. Tanaka was not part of any military unit at that point. She was with a civilian salvage team working the rubble for copper wire and structural material. She found it because her hand went into a crevice that she was not planning to put her hand into, and came back out holding something warm. 8 months, said Mara, remembering. You received some of the broadcast, said Nemesis. Good. Yes. 8 months of daily contact, 3 hours per session, with detailed written documentation after each one. She was methodical in a way that Dr. Sahu had been methodical, and that Corporal Ndiaye, by his own admission, had not been, not through any failure of Ndiaye's. Because Ndiaye had not had 8 months, he had had 6 weeks and a recovery team on his trail. Dr. Tanaka had 8 months, and the protection of a listening post that had been very carefully built to look like nothing. She used them. She developed a notation system for documenting what the sphere showed her. Part scientific, something she described as resembling musical notation, because the information had a quality of rhythm to it, of recurring motifs that straight prose notation failed to capture. She said that if you tried to write it in sentences, you lost the part of it that was the point. Did she find? Mara asked. Dr. Tanaka found the instructions, said Nemesis. Not for the sphere's general function, Doctor. Sahu had mapped that as thoroughly as was possible in 3 months. What Dr. Tanaka found, in 8 months of daily contact, was the pathway. The root-level access channel that the Vathari had created in the early years of their possession, before they fully understood what they were holding. When they had been trying to make it more usable and had built into its structure a layer of access that connected to every system the sphere had learned simultaneously. A master key to the master key, if you like. They had buried it deeply in the subsequent 4,000 years of use, layered over it with so many additional protocols and access structures that it was for all practical purposes invisible. The sphere itself had not forgotten it. The sphere remembered everything. Dr. Tanaka spent 8 months and found it in the notation that the sphere and she developed together, precise sequence of intent and attention that opened the pathway. And she left the instructions, said Mara. She left everything, said Mnemosyne. In her notation, in my memory banks, in the 2-second pulse encoded below Vathari monitoring thresholds, that I have been broadcasting since the post went dark 412 days ago. She thought. She said this explicitly in her final session recording. She thought that the sphere did not simply teach you what it knew, passively, contact. She thought the sphere was an active participant in the learning, that it had preferences about who understood it and what they understood, that it had been waiting, in the Vathari archive, for something, a species that learned differently than the Vathari learned. The Vathari were patient and systematic, and they used the sphere for 4,000 years, and they learned, through that use, to navigate with it, to take from it the specific outputs that they needed for specific navigation tasks. They had never, she believed, tried to understand it. They had used it as a tool without ever asking what the tool itself knew about being used. A human inclination, she wrote. The inclination to be in relationship with the things we hold, to ask them what they are, to listen for the answer. This was not a weakness. It was the specific quality that the sphere had been waiting for. Mara sat very still. The amber light at the sphere's center was doing something she could not describe precisely. It was present in the room in a way it had not been when she first arrived, as if the telling of the history had warmed it, or as if the sphere itself was listening. She said, "Why didn't anyone use it? Tanaka found the pathway." "She did not have time," said Mnemosyne. "She died of the atmospheric sickness on the 9th day of her 9th month. She documented the pathway completely. She documented the sequence of attention and intent required to open it, which she described as less like operating a control and more like the moment in which you stop reading music from the page and begin to hear it. She had not yet attempted to open it herself. She had found the lock. She had mapped every detail of the lock. She had documented precisely the shape of what fit inside the lock. But she had not used it. And then the post went dark. The event that took the post's personnel, which I was not fully conscious during, and therefore cannot fully describe, though I have reconstructed from sensor data that it was a Vathari targeting event, and that it was over in a very short time. And since then I have been broadcasting, waiting for someone to come through that door." Mara understood now the quality of the signal. Not desperation. Not a machine broadcasting in the blind hope that someone was listening. Something more specific than that. A call with a specific receiver in mind. A lock broadcasting the description of its own key. She stood. She crossed the room to the table. She stood over the sphere. "How long do I need?" she asked. "I cannot tell you with certainty," said Mnemosyne. Dr. Sahu had 3 months of daily contact. Earl Ndiaye had 6 weeks and reached what he estimated as 1/10 of fluency. Dr. Tanaka had 8 months and found the pathway, but Dr. Tanaka documented the pathway, and I have been broadcasting that documentation in the sphere's own notation, in compressed form, in the 2-second pulse, for 412 days. If your receiver was capable of interpreting the compressed notation, if you have been absorbing it as you traveled, then you are not beginning from nothing. You are beginning from a foundation that took Dr. Tanaka 8 months to build. The sphere will recognize what you already know. It will not make you start from the beginning." Mara looked at the sphere. She thought about her mother humming in the kitchen. An old song, nothing important, just the sound she made when she was in a moment, rather than worried about the next one. She did not know why she thought of that at this specific instant. She suspected. In some way she would not have been able to articulate, but that felt undeniable in the way that very few things felt undeniable anymore, that the sphere had shown it to her, that it had reached into the catalog of her, and found the thing that was most purely, specifically her, not the soldier, not the pragmatist, not the person who had adjusted and adjusted and adjusted until she was mostly adjustment, the person who had grown up helping her mother in the kitchen, and watching her father read the sky for weather, learning from both of them the difference between paying attention to a thing and being in relationship with it. She put her hand on the sphere. The warmth arrived first. Not the surface warmth of a held object, but something structural. Warmth in the bones of her hand, in the joints, in the neural pathways that ran from her fingers through her wrist and up her arm, and then presence, A vast, attentive, patient presence that recognized her, not surprise. The fulfillment of an expectation held for a very long time, and beneath that, layered, dense, possible in its scope, but navigable. In the way a city, you have studied the maps for 11 days of walking, is navigable when you finally arrive. The shape of everything the sphere knew, every Vathari system, every protocol, every command channel, every atmospheric processor, every fleet body propulsion architecture, every weapons array, every collector network, every biological interface. The entire civilizational nervous system of the species that was erasing humanity, mapped in a depth and detail that no human instrument had come close to, and there, at the root of all of it, exactly where Dr. Tanaka's notations had said it would be, the pathway. Barely visible the way a foundation stone is barely visible in a finished building, but is the reason the building stands, the master channel, the access point that connected to everything simultaneously. She felt the shape of it. She felt the shape of the key. She felt it the way you feel a lock give. The slight, mechanical sigh of a thing that has been held shut for a very long time releasing. "They're coming," said Nemosin. The door shook on its hinges from the pressure wave of something very large displacing. Atmosphere at velocity, a second wave, a third, a fourth. 4 distinct arrivals, each slightly different in signature, the way different instruments register differently in the body, even when they are playing together. Through the sphere, Mara felt what she was feeling before she consciously understood she was feeling it. 4 Vathari command forms, the apex of the fleet's organizational hierarchy, each one the designated vector of a different extinction protocol. The one whose biological contamination function she recognized from the way the atmosphere tasted. It was responsible for what had been done to the sky, to the soil, to the invisible kingdom of living things that turned death into life. The one designated for information suppression, whose function she recognized from the silence, from the dead instruments, and the dead broadcasts, and the years of operating without communications. The one designated for infrastructure removal, the bridges, the power grids, the water systems, the interlocking architecture of civilization, and the one designated for what the Vathari called the final accounting, the terminal protocol that came when the other protocols had done sufficient work, when there was little enough left that the accounting could be completed quickly. They were not here for her. They were here for the sphere. They had always been tracking it, the warmth of it, the quality of presence, the resonance of something that had spent 4,000 years in their care, and had imprinted on them the way they had imprinted on it. They wanted it back, the way you want back the thing that knows everything about you. And they had brought enough to ensure they were not refused. The door opened. The first command form through it was immense. Vathari command forms were larger than their soldiers, broader in the thorax, with layered cranial plates that designated rank, that caught the torchlight, and threw it back in flat, cold angles. It communicated in the subsonic register, a frequency that hit the human chest like a hand pressing inward. What it communicated, in Dr. Tanaka's notation, was the word that meant set it down and step away. A word that in the Vathari language carried no undertone of mercy, only of procedure, only of the assumption that the procedure would be followed, because there was no alternative to following it. More filled the space behind the first. They were very still. Vathari went still the way machines went still. Not resting but accumulating, holding. At precisely below a threshold she could feel through the sphere, patient in a way that was entirely different from human patience, because it had no concern for outcome. They did not need her to comply. They were simply waiting for her to stop being a variable. Mara looked at the first command form. She looked at it through the sphere, which meant she saw not only its physical form, but its architecture. The communication channels running through its biological structure, pulsion interfaces embedded in its secondary thoracic plates, the targeting systems that were even now warming up with the particular calibration of something being used at close range. She saw all of this. She had Dr. Tanaka's 8 months and 11 days of walking and 412 days of pressed notation in the 2-second pulse, and she had 1 hour of direct contact, and she felt the shape of the key and the shape of the lock, and she understood what Dr. Tanaka had meant. It was less like operating a control and more like the moment when you stop reading music from the page and begin to hear it. She thought about Ndiaye picking the sphere up off the ground in the middle of a firefight because something in him recognized it before he did. She thought about Okonkwo catching it in his hands by accident and being briefly and overwhelmingly homesick. She thought about Tanaka spending 8 months developing a notation that was part science and part music because she understood that the rational and the felt were not separate channels. She thought about her mother humming in the kitchen, present in the moment, not worried about the next one. She asked the sphere, in the language they had been building together since she first turned toward the signal, since the compressed notations began absorbing into her on 11 days of walking, since the first moment her hand made contact and the vast accumulated patience of the thing recognized her. She asked it, show them. The nearest command form opened its cranial plates in the Vathari alarm reflex. It had felt the pathway activate. It had felt, in the way that you feel a key turning in a wall you had bricked up 8,000 years ago and forgotten, the root-level channel, opening. 300 kilometers in every direction, across the entire region of Vathari operational presence, every system flickered. Propulsion, communications, weapons targeting atmospheric processors, collector networks, biological interfaces. Period of time that was very short in human terms and infinite in machine terms. Every Vathari system in range received an instruction set that was not theirs, not Mara's, not anyone's. The sphere's own knowledge, rerouted through the root channel, redirected back toward the source, toward the fleet bodies above, toward the atmospheric processors, toward the 4 command forms in the doorway. She did not choose specifically what the sphere did. She did not need to. The sphere knew these systems the way a physician knows a body. Not just the map of it, but the logic of it, the way each component depended on and communicated with every other. The specific vulnerabilities that 8,000 years of intimate knowledge had accumulated. What the sphere sent back into the Vathari systems was chosen by the sphere itself from Dr. Tanaka's notation and Sahu's documentation and Ndiaye's 6 weeks, and everything that Mara had contributed in the hour of contact and the 11 days of walking toward the pulse. It was chosen with a precision she could not have consciously directed. It was chosen well. The first command form fell to its knees. Not the slow, deliberate descent of something choosing to kneel. The involuntary collapse of a thing that has had the architecture of its own will taken out from under it. The second, third, fourth followed in a sequence, staggered, like a rhythm losing its time. The subsonic communication that had been filling the room like a hand pressing on the chest stuttered down through registers Mara had no names for, and then went quiet. Above the building, at altitude, the atmospheric processors, which had been running without pause for 3 years, which had poisoned the sky and the soil and the invisible kingdom, went dark. She felt them go through the sphere, felt the cessation of their vibration in her sternum, and in the sudden silence left by their absence, she could hear something she had not heard in 3 years. Wind, just moving air that had no agenda and no extinction protocol, moving through the gaps in the concrete, with a sound like something breathing out after a very long time of holding it in. She set the sphere down on the table. It was still warm. It remained in its quality of focused presence, as if satisfied, not in a programmed sense, not in the sense of a process completing, but in the way that a very old piece of work is satisfied when it is finally used for the purpose it was, built for by hands that had taken the time to understand it. The 4 Vathari command forms were on the floor. They were not dead. She had not attempted to kill them, and she did not believe the sphere was designed for killing in the direct sense. It was designed for something more thorough than killing. The architecture of will that animated those command forms, that connected them to their fleet bodies and their protocols and their 8,000 years of civilizational momentum, that architecture was unreachable to them. They were breathing. She was fairly certain that was all they were currently doing. She picked up her pack. She checked her compass. It still pointed wherever the Vathari wanted it to point, and she stood for a moment considering that. And then she felt. Through something that was not the sphere, since she was no longer touching it, but that might have been something the sphere had left in her. She felt the atmospheric processors go from dark to absent. Dissolved. Not powered down but deconstituted, in the way the Vathari dissolved their ships back into component mass. Something had happened to them. Something the sphere had instructed, had caused them to do to themselves what they did to damaged vessels. Without the atmospheric processors, the interference that kept the comps unreliable would fade in hours. Southwest was southwest. She had walked 11 days. She would walk back. She stopped at the door. "Mnemosyne," she said. "Yes," said the voice, with the quality it had now, the quality of something that had been waiting for a very long time and had arrived somewhere. "Tanaka's notations, everything you have on this. Can you transmit it? Broadly?" "I have 60 to 80 hours of broadcast capacity," said Mnemosyne. "If I cease the narrow band encoded pulse and broadcast on all available frequencies, everything I have, at full power, I can reach receivers as far as the atmospheric interference allows. With the processors down, that range will increase significantly over the next several hours. By morning it could be very large." "Do that," said Mara. "Yes," said Mnemosyne. "I will start now." Mara stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked at the sphere on the table, amber warm, patient as geology, waiting for the next hands that would need to understand it. "Thank you," she said, and was not certain to whom. Outside, the sky was still bruise yellow at the edges where the damage was oldest and deepest. But overhead, directly above the listening post, where the atmospheric processors had been running thickest, there was a gap, not large. A gap the size of her hand held at arm's length. Through it, visible for the first time in 3 years, from this particular piece of ground, was something dark and absolute, and full of the cold, permanent fire of other suns. She looked at it for a long moment. She let herself feel the weight of it. Not the small and insignificant weight. Not the "you are temporary and the universe is not" weight. The other one. The one that had been making people lift their eyes to the skies, since before they had words for why. Since before they were fully people in the technical sense. The weight of something enormous, that was also, somehow, theirs. They had been born looking toward, without knowing why, and that they had never stopped looking toward, even when looking took everything. She walked into the dark with that weight on her, and it was lighter than anything she had carried in 3 years. Behind her, Noemi began to broadcast. The signal went out on every frequency it could reach, rising as the night cleared and the interference faded, reaching further as the hours passed, and the gap in the damaged sky widened. It went out in Dr. Tanaka's notation, which was part science and part music, and could be learned by anyone willing to hold something long enough. It went out toward the refugee columns and the hidden outposts, and the salvage teams working through rubble, and the soldiers still in the field. And the persons who had found ways to be useful with whatever they had left. By morning, the gap overhead was large enough to walk through if you could reach it. And it kept widening. And the signal kept going. The sphere sat on the table in the listening post, warm as it had always been warm, waiting as it had always waited, patient with a patience that was not resignation but purpose. The patience of something that had been made to be held by whoever came next, and that knew, now, that whoever came next was coming. It had been waiting 8,000 years. It had been right to wait.